Good evening. I'm Ben Brotemarkle, Executive Director of the Florida Historical Society. Welcome to what is the last scheduled Florida Historical Society Archaeological Institute lecture here in this space, but more on that in a moment. You are here at the Library of Florida History. This is our statewide headquarters for the Florida Historical Society. We maintain an archive of thousands of rare and out-of-print books, maps dating back to the 1500s, photographs, postcards, genealogical information, all sorts of great educational resources here at our library. We also operate the Florida Historical Society Press, which publishes about 10 books a year. Many of them, well, all of them, in fact, are in our bookstore. We hope you'll peruse that after the lecture this evening. We have a lot of great books on archaeology, so please check them out. We also do educational outreach all over the state, particularly through our radio program, Florida Frontiers, the weekly radio magazine of the Florida Historical Society, which airs on public radio stations all around the state. Here locally, you can hear it Thursday evenings at 6:30 and Sunday afternoons at 4. We have an article in the local paper every Tuesday that we hope you can read. It's also online. You can find it there. We do all sorts of things. We operate the historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens in Eau Gallie. So lots of great activities all around the state, but mostly here in Brevard County, although we do have outreach throughout the state. But we don't get state funding. So we depend on membership support, and I'm looking around and I see many of you are members, but a few haven't signed up yet. So we would like to encourage you to become a member this evening if you are not a member of the Florida Historical Society. It's easy to do. We'll be happy to do it after the lecture. You'll get our Florida Historical Quarterly, our great academic journal, our newsletter, the Society Report. We have a great tote bag to give you and a free book or two, and so it's a great time to become a member as well, because one of the other great activities, as you may have heard this week, we are now, the Florida Historical Society, are now the proud owners of the Brevard Museum of History and Natural Science. And that's a really exciting venture for both the Florida Historical Society and the Brevard Museum. It gives us a whole nother venue to explore Florida history, particularly through Brevard County examples, and also it'll be great for the museum as well. So we're very excited about that, and a lot of news happening there. And as I mentioned, this is the last Florida Historical Society Archaeological Institute lecture in this space, but that's because the Brevard Museum of History and Natural Science is now the physical home of the Florida Historical Society Archaeological Institute. So very exciting things happening, and you've heard him on the radio and you've seen him in the newspaper, but maybe you have not met yet Bruce Piatek, who is the director of the Florida Historical Society Archaeological Institute and the Brevard Museum of History and Natural Science. And we're very lucky to have Bruce. You couldn't find a person better suited to this position. He's a professional archaeologist. He was city archaeologist of St. Augustine, ran the museum in St. Augustine for the Historic Preservation Board there. He has worked with every major archaeologist in the state, pretty much, and done a lot of great work himself in archaeology. And for 20 years, he ran the Florida Agricultural Museum in Palm Coast. So he's great archaeological experience and museum administration experience. We couldn't ask for somebody better to move both FHSAI and the Brevard Museum forward. So let me introduce to you now Bruce Piatek.
Thank you, Ben. You set the bar kind of high there. I'm going to have to do a lot. Thank you very much, and I'm really pleased to be here, happy to be working for the Florida Historical Society, and look forward to having you all out at the Brevard Museum for the next meeting. It's going to be a great marriage and a great facility for the Florida Historical Society. The Archaeological Institute, looking forward to working with each of you through that organization as well, and we're always looking for volunteers and people who want to get involved and learn more about Florida archaeology and Florida history. What I'm here and have the fortunate, well, before I do that, let me tell you also, upcoming in November on the 14th and then again on the 15th, we're going to be having a new exhibit opening at the museum. It will really be kind of our showcase exhibit for the Florida Historical Society and its marriage with the Brevard Museum. And that is going to deal with the Hubble Space Telescope, and it's going to be an exciting exhibit that we're opening. We'll have a special opening on Friday night by invitation. It's a fundraising event for the Florida Historical Society. We hope to have some special guests there and a preview opening for that exhibit. And there'll be entertainment and food. And we also have a Jackson Walker painting of Ponce's sighting of Florida. And so that will be unveiled at that event as well. And it's a nice connection between the sense of discovery that really took place here in Florida between Ponce discovering Florida and us discovering space and exploring the outer reaches of space with the Hubble Space Telescope. And one of the things that struck me as kind of interesting as an archaeologist is that archaeologists look into the past to learn about what has taken place. And this Hubble Space Telescope is doing virtually the same thing. Astronomers use that technology to look at light that is billions of years old to understand the formation of the universe. So they too are looking into the past. So between astronomers and archaeologists, we have a connection there of what we're studying and how we're learning about our world and the people that lived in it. But I'm particularly pleased tonight to introduce to you our speaker. We have Patrisha Meyers, who's a graduate student with the University of Central Florida. She's going to be telling us about the interesting intrigue of how one studies the human skeletal remains. How do you get your samples? How do you find out? How do you learn? What's the process? And that whole interesting tidbits, I'm looking forward to learning about some of the more perhaps gruesome details of the process. So when you start talking about body farms, it's got to be interesting. So without further ado, I'll introduce our speaker, Patrisha Meyers.
Thank you. For those of you who weren't here when I spoke in the past, my focus is generally forensic anthropology. That's what I've done most of my studies in. I did my undergraduate work at the University of Central Florida and did a year at Mercyhurst, focusing mainly on biological and forensic anthropology. And as Bruce mentioned, I'm working on my master's degree now at the University of Central Florida. I'm also working part-time at the District 9 Medical Examiner's Office as a death investigator. So anatomy is near and dear to my heart, but there is a little bit of controversy that goes along with how we acquire our teaching specimens, how we have in the past, and how we should handle it in the future. Still not hearing me? Okay. I don't know if it's working or not. Is that better? Yeah, there we go. I'm just too short. Okay, so tonight we're going to talk about anatomical teaching material. And I'd like to diverge a little bit from the typical anthropology discussion where I just share with you things I've learned, and I want to ask you to engage in the topic. And the reason for that is most people don't think about anatomical specimens unless they're in the biological or medical sciences, but they really are important to all of us. So tonight, I'd like you, if you would, to imagine that you have a serious illness, and it's not pleasant imagining, but think about all the resources that are available to you. And if you did have a problem with your heart or your kidneys, where would you go and what would you do? A few years ago, I had the opportunity to visit the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, and it is the premier medical facility in the United States. This year, 2014, it was ranked #1 of all hospitals in the States. And when you go there, you see your primary doctor. So if you're going for a kidney problem, you're going to see a nephrologist. But that's not the only doctor you'll see. You're going to have a team of doctors who take a look at every part of your body and how it interacts. And what they're trying to do is get a holistic understanding of what's happening with all these systems that work together in your body. That way they can provide to you the very best treatment plan that will help you get healthy as quickly as possible. Now I want you to imagine that you lived in the Neolithic and you had epilepsy. What kind of resources are going to be available to you then? Well, there are resources. This is an image of trepanation, and what that is when someone drills or cuts into the skull to relieve pressure. We know that this was practiced at this time. We don't know exactly why. We believe that it could be to deal with a seizure issue like epilepsy or a mental illness to let out evil spirits. We also believe that it was utilized to handle traumatic injuries that could occur from a fall or from warfare. But what we do know is that people survived it. Some people didn't, but a surprising number of people did survive this surgery with no modern medical intervention. We know this because we see bony remodeling of the skull, and that's the body's response to this type of injury. And it takes time. It takes months, not days. So we know that people live through this procedure long enough for this remodeling to occur. So now what I'd like you to think about is, how did we get from the Neolithic to the Mayo Clinic? We're going to start with Hippocrates, since he is considered the father of modern medicine. And when we think about that, we think, wow, he took a scientific look at how the body works and he got it. And he did get a lot of things that were really important, but his premise was based on these 4 humors. The idea, he looked at blood, and blood separates into 4 main components. One's kind of pinkish and light-colored, one's kind of dark, one's kind of yellow, one's kind of white. And he thought that these things related to the other types of fluids he could see come out of a body when someone was sick. He could see blood, he could see yellow bile, he could see a black bile, and he could see phlegm. And each one of these, he believed, related to a different part of the body. And he also believed that they related to the 4 elements that we see in nature. So this was the first beginnings of understandings of how the human body worked. About 600 years later, he's followed by Galen, who took the idea a step further and said, well, to really understand the body, we need to look inside it. But as happens throughout much of history, there are a lot of societal taboos against cutting people open. I think it's fascinating, but people didn't always think that, and even today, a lot of people don't think it's as fascinating as I do. However, he was able to dissect animals, and that was where the beginning of an understanding for how the circulatory system interacted with the lymphatic system and how all these things played out together. But as you can see from this line drawing, not even all animals are put together in exactly the same way. And most humans are not put together exactly the way that animals are. And this did create some problems. And along with this, we also want to think about, from the original Hippocrates idea about the different fluids that he saw in the body, in order for mental and physical health, he wanted to keep them in balance. So some of the ideas that came out of that are like bloodletting, which we know today is not the best way to handle an illness. But at the time, from a scientific standpoint, it seemed to make sense. We'd like to think that we moved forward in this constant progression of improvements, but we didn't. We hit the Middle Ages, and with it, there was this period that moved away from a scientific, empirical approach to understanding the body and how it worked to a more spiritual approach. A lot of this had to do with the power that the church was gaining at the time, and people began to think of other things that might be causing these problems in their body. And this picture is generally called the Zodiac Man, but I liked this one better. It's the Zodiac Woman. A lot of the treatments they had at that time depended on where in the zodiac you were. So it wasn't treating your illness alone. It was treating your illness based on other factors that really had nothing to do with the way the body worked. Levi Strauss, who's a noted early anthropologist, put it together and explained it that it was this shamanistic complex based on this whole societal connectedness, this idea that the shaman or medicine man or sorcerer believed in his own power. Then your patient begins to believe in this power, and then society as a group believes in it, and it's this circular reinforcing system that people got stuck in a trap of, this is kind of how we handle the body during this time. The next big jump in improvement came with the Renaissance. At this time, there was an easing up on the laws against dissection. Some of the early Renaissance artists were able to do some of their own dissections. This picture is one that Leonardo da Vinci drew. He's credited with some of the earliest anatomically correct drawings. We believe that he did about 30 of his own autopsies in order to learn how the body was put together. Unfortunately, his drawings were not widely distributed. He held them until the time of his death and left them to an heir to distribute. But because of the nature of the drawings, that didn't happen as quickly. as would have helped. So even though the drawings were happening, the information wasn't being disseminated. How some of this information was coming back was through the Crusades, because the Middle Eastern countries had not moved as far away from the scientific understanding of the human body as Western Europe had. So as people were coming back from the Crusades, they're bringing this information with them. And this is the same time that the first hospitals were really, the true hospitals were being established. They created hospitals just to handle communicable diseases. And they got the idea that although they didn't have germ theory, they knew that if they isolated these people, other people weren't getting sick as well. So Vesalius is really the father of modern anatomy. He was a 22-year-old medical student. And the way his classes were held, he was in a big auditorium setting, and he had an instructor who was holding up Gallen's pictures of animals, which are 1,300 years old about now, and saying, all right, so this is how the body works. And when we think about this being the text they use, it's not like I have a textbook and my classmate has a textbook. This is the textbook that the instructor has, and you learn from it through a verbal exchange of knowledge, not through hands-on training. So he's out walking one night, and he comes across a man who had been executed for a crime. And he sees this body and realizes the value in it and attempts to take it down from the gallows. But he only gets the arms, because as bodies decompose, they come apart. He takes these arms back to his lodgings and begins what we would today call maceration. He's taking it apart, he's looking at how it's putting together. He does eventually macerate, clean all the tissues off of the bones, and he's left with these really cool bones. So he starts drawing, because he's also an artist. And this is the result. In 1543, this is a really well-known, that's why I picked it. I think a lot of people have probably seen it. But this is, and I will totally botch the Latin, so my daughter will yell at me. I'm going to stick with English. On the Fabric of the Human Body is how he titled his book. And the pictures from it, if you go online and you look at them, they're just amazing. But this became the way people learned. But there's still, if you can see, this is a body being dissected, and these are all the students. So it's still not like what we think of today, where medical students go in and a group of 3 or 4 work on one body. This was through demonstration, again, still not through hands-on learning. So now that I've hopefully laid a foundation for where we came from, and I hope started you thinking about how important it is to really be able, for your doctor, to have had practical experience with the human body. I mean, think about it. If this guy back here was your doctor and you needed your appendix taken out in an emergency, do you want to be his first patient? Or would you like for him to have had a little bit of practice first? So now that hopefully you see that this is a very important field of study, I'm going to turn it around a little bit and ask you, have we always done it in the right way? So I took a class last spring that really got me thinking about this, and the idea of exploring the scientific prerogative. I think people have heard the term the scientific authority, that, you know, science has this authority, but I think it goes beyond that. Authority indicates the right or power to cause people to do things, but prerogative is a little different. It's a right or privilege, especially a right or privilege that some people have, not that everyone has. And as scientists, historically, I believe that we have taken the position that what we do is so important for mankind that sometimes the ends justify the means. So I approached this with 2 questions in mind. One is, historically, has science overridden the cultural or personal rights with a scientific authority so strong and exclusive that it became within the realm of the prerogative of science to acquire and study human remains? And if this is the case, how has this history shaped our present research climate? So that's what I want to talk about now, and I want you guys to keep putting yourselves in the shoes of that patient, of that guy in the very back row that really can't see a whole lot about what's happening in this dissection. So in the dissecting room, there's a really cool book written in 1896 called The Diary of a Resurrectionist. And it was written by a man who practiced this as a way of earning a living. And what a resurrectionist was someone who went out after you buried Grandpa, waited until the funeral was over and dug Grandpa back up and took him to a doctor so that he could be dissected like you saw, or like you see in this picture, in a dissecting room, so that your doctor can learn how to take out your appendix. There's another, I really like this quote. I'm sorry, I have to keep turning because I don't have them memorized. But the complaint as to the scarcities of bodies for dissection is as old as the history of anatomy itself. And I think that's true. And there's another author that I like a lot and that I took a lot of ideas from, who compared the collection of cadavers for anatomy and the collection of skeletal remains for anthropology, which I'm going to cover in just a minute. But she said that grave robbing is the world's second oldest profession. It began taking the valuables that the people were buried with. And, they were buried with jewels and things to see them into the afterlife. But it transitioned during this period in the 17th, 18th century to where the body became the commodity itself, because it was worth quite a bit of money to these anatomists. So we come to the idea of supply and demand. In the 18th century, the resurrectionists were rampant in Great Britain and in the United States. And this was how they were able to study, to teach their students. The Company of Barbers and Surgeons was the reigning committee or oversight in this time, and they were charged with supplying these bodies to the schools of anatomy. However, the bodies they supplied were convicted criminals. They were malefactors of society, and there weren't enough of them. As soon as people began to understand how the body worked, more and more medical schools came into existence with more and more students, and the need for these bodies, because population was also exploding. So you live out in the country, you don't have your own doctor, you want to get doctors trained. So as you're trying to train more doctors, you're running into this need of more bodies. The Committee of Anatomy petitioned for the bodies of people from the poorhouses. And they said, you're burying them in paupers' graves anyway. Why don't you let us have them? Unfortunately, their petition was denied. So in the absence of a legitimate source of bodies, the doctors were put in this position, and again, I'm asking you to step back because you're going to talk about a lot of things where you're going to think, oh, that was so wrong, but put yourself back and be that patient and think about what training you want your doctor to have. So the anatomists hired resurrection men. Men, women, and children were all very valuable because they needed to understand how the body changed through all periods of life. What was normal? What's normal human variation? It's something we still struggle with today. And premiums were paid for pathologies because that gave them the chance to see what's really wrong with people. Very few questions were asked, and we had the first culture of don't ask, don't tell, which led to Burke and Hare. So from my title, From Burke and Hare to the Body Farm, this is how we started getting our anatomical specimens, our teaching material. Scotland, Edinburgh, is considered the hub of medical learning at that time, and it's still a primary resource of medical research. Burke and Hare, they're both named William, lived there. Hare ran a boarding house, and they both worked on the canals. They had a lodger, Hare had a lodger, who, according to him, passed away and still owed him money. He didn't have any family, so he and his buddy Burke hauled him in to Dr. Knox and said, well, I know you're looking for bodies. And he said, sure, I'll pay you handsomely. Well, that started them thinking. It was really inconvenient to wait for somebody to die. So they found that they could suffocate people and make it look pretty natural, and this became called Burking. So from 1827 to 1829, they were charged with 17 murders. Dr. Knox, don't ask, don't tell, he didn't know they were murdered, so he didn't get in trouble. So 1832, the Anatomy Acts are put in place to deal with things like this, because early on, while it was illegal to steal grandma's watch, it was not illegal to steal grandma. So this is the turning point here where we start to see an awakening of the knowledge that we really need to have bodies to study. How are we going to get them? However, in the meantime, if you buried grandma, you wanted to be able to protect her. And how could you do that? Well, it was a little different in Great Britain and in the United States. In both cases, it tended to be the marginalized that were most at risk, However, that didn't mean they stayed away from wealthy cemeteries. If you had enough money, you could put in a mort safe, which is, I don't know if you can see very well, but these are iron bars over the body that's being excavated, and they were intended to keep people out, to make it difficult. If you could get a body up quickly, you're going to pick that one, you're not going to pick this one. This is another form of a mort safe. A lot of people were interred in mausoleums, which were then locked. However, in the United States, because we have a different history, we also have this wonderful history of slavery. If you were black, it was also a little more dangerous. So in the United States, whiteness was a form of protection. For emphasis. So, and again, this is where we have to sometimes take a look back at our history and question how and why we've done things. And this is a bill of sale for a young girl, a young Negro girl, for 38 pounds. She was sold from one owner to another. I calculated it, I found an exchange rate for today, that would be about $1,760 for a human life. What's even more egregious beyond that is the idea. Samuel Clossy was an anatomist. I believe he was in Boston in the 1760s. He had slaves, his friends had slaves, and one of his friend's slaves passed away. And he said, I'll buy him from you, even though he's dead, because I'm going to buy him for the sake of the skeleton. And that's where some of our anatomical specimens came from, and it was perfectly legal. So, from anatomy to anthropology. As anthropologists, we consider ourselves scientists as well, and we like to think that we do things for the greater good. And these are some of our founding fathers. I think they'll be familiar to many of you. Franz Boas is really well respected. I know he's one of Kevin's special favorites. And he's done a lot to advance anthropology. However, in 1886, while he's doing his ethnographies, he's also in the evenings digging up the ancestors of the people he's studying. And this is a quote from his diary. I've carefully locked the skeleton in my trunk until I can pack it away. Yesterday, I wrote the museum in Washington asking if they were considering buying skulls this winter for $600. Think about how much $600 was back in 1886. Alois Hrdlicka, he's the founder of the American Journal of Physical Anthropology, which is my field, so this is one of my guys, as I pick on Kevin for one of his guys. He had a visitor come in, an Eskimo from Greenland, who happened to have the misfortune to die. So instead of shipping him back to Greenland, he macerated him and articulated a skeleton. And Flinders Petrie, he's the father of scientific archaeology. He was an early Egyptologist, first chair of Egyptology in the United Kingdom. He studied Egyptian skulls looking at migration patterns. So when the university in London asked him for a small sample, he sent a measly 400. So this is our history. A lot of it's really good, but I think you have to look at all of it. And how did this happen? And this is the question that we ask today is, we can't imagine macerating a visitor, but how did these things happen at this time? It's because there's dual realities to the idea of human remains. There's the cultural significance, and there's the scientific significance. And that's changed over time. Culturally, people used to believe, and in some cases still do, that the soul and the body were intertwined, and that if the body wasn't buried, the soul then could never escape and move on to the next stage, whatever happens after life. But as science expanded, we began to understand, and scientists began to try and share the idea that the body was just a vessel. Whatever your belief system was about the soul, the body was just the vessel that it lived in here on earth, and once the body died, the soul was no longer a part of it. And that made it okay. It made it more understandable for the need to study the human body. And remember, you're still the patient of that guy way back in the last row of that dissection auditorium. So that's part of how this happened, how there was this disconnect between what seems right to us and what seemed right to scientists at the time that had no other resources. But how come it was okay to dig up the marginalized? How come, in all honesty, the scientists were not digging up their forebears? There's different worldviews on burial practices. For Europeans, generally, cemeteries are well marked, they're well maintained. The ones that aren't maintained are sometimes all relocated, even the European cemeteries, because they feel that they've been abandoned. Well, for Native Americans in particular, that's not how they mark their burials. They're buried in a natural setting. Where these burials are located is passed down through oral tradition. And when Native Americans were forced to leave ancestral lands, then over time, these locations were lost to memory, but they were never actually abandoned in the sense that Europeans looked at it. So this one I'm going to have to turn a little bit so that I can talk to you as I talk about it. This is Fortune's story. This man's name, we don't know what his real name was, but in the records he was called Fortune. He was an African American who was born in the 1740s. He lived in Waterbury, Connecticut. He was a husband to Dinah. He was a father to 2 boys and 2 girls. He was an Episcopalian. He was baptized in 1797. Unfortunately, he passed away the next year in 1798. And even more unfortunately, he was owned by Dr. Preserved Porter of Waterbury, Connecticut, who was their preeminent physician and also the man who taught other students about anatomy. So when Fortune passed away, his wife and his children were still owned by Dr. Porter. But what happened next is Fortune was macerated, he was articulated, and then he was labeled, and then he was studied, and then he was forgotten. But while all these other things were happening, I wonder about his family, and I wonder what Dinah thought with him, just a few yards away in the doctor's office being studied by the doctor's students. He was rediscovered in a closet, and for a while he was displayed in a museum. And then questions surfaced, and we started thinking more and more about where do our anatomical specimens come from? So some research was done. He was removed from the original display. He was analyzed forensically. I really wish I had been part of this team, but they did a very thorough forensic analysis. He was reconstructed, and then he was buried. And he finally received an appropriate level of respect because it's unlikely Fortune was a body donor. And as I'll talk a little more later, I really believe in body donation, but I only believe in it if that's what the person wants. And given the mores of the time and the fact that his family was right there, it seems really unlikely that that's how all this happened to him. But he's going to be remembered. So this is medical ed. What other types of anatomical specimens were there at this time? I thought this was really interesting. I went to the forensic meetings out in Seattle and happened across him in a shop. So I took pictures, and I found out what I could. This is an early anatomical preparation from the 1900s. The bones, muscles, and tendons are all real, and then he's supplemented with wax and paper mache. This is how people learned this was their dissection material at that time. When you couldn't preserve, even regardless of how you got the cadaver, they didn't have the preservatives right now. We can work on a cadaver for a whole semester. But back then, they had a couple days before it got really stinky. So this was one way that they could continue to study the human body. But we don't know how Ed wound up there. We don't know if he was from a workhouse and had no family. There was a limited amount of donation that was trying to be encouraged, but it was pretty rare. So, teaching specimens. I'm going to move a little more towards the osteological side, since that's kind of my area, and talk about where most of them came from. We talked about the history of body snatching and anatomical specimens in the United States and Europe. And then here in the United States, from the 18th to the 20th century, India was the leading supplier of osteological material, of human skeletons. They exported them. It was a great business. My understanding was in the 1940s and 50s, with your fee to medical school, whatever it was at that time, for about $200, you got a complete skeleton as part of your studies. When my uncle went to medical school in the late 1970s, early 80s, he said they had one short course in osteology, and that was about it. So over time, it moved away from all doctors learning, and I think that had to do also with specialization became more popular. So I'm sure that an orthopedic guy probably spent more time with bones. But we at least had a steady supply of these skeletons in order to study them. Think about your dentist, your orthodontist. They all got skulls so that they could study, and they have, you can see here the cutaways. That's so that you can see where the roots go in, where the nerves come in. They have little wires that they've attached. These are all real skulls. This is a juvenile from India. This is an adult from India. This is a really interesting skull. It was prepared at the turn of the century in France, but it's of African ancestry, so I don't know how he wound up in France. But these were all prepared for study by medical students. In 1985, India banned the export of osteological material. Their reason for banning it is they found a shipment of 1,500 juvenile skeletons, and there was discussion that perhaps these children were street urchins that had been collected and murdered for their bodies. There was never proof of it, and this was the second time. There had been a ban a few years earlier that was lifted, but this ban has stuck. We have not gotten any more osteological material from India since 1985. In that time since then, China stepped in. They started exporting a little bit because this is a great market, and these things are pretty expensive. But their material was not to the quality that India's was, and if you're going to teach students, you do need good quality material. The same thing with Russia. They started emptying out their excess from their museums, but they hadn't been prepared like these have with the dissection cuts. They hadn't been prepared with the intention of being studied. They were prepared as museum specimens, and they'd had some rough wear. So we no longer have any steady supply of osteological material from these types of sources. So how are we changing this, or what are we going to do about it? What have we done about it? We've been cultivating and legislating change. The biggest change that came out in public perception occurred in the 1950s and 60s. These are two articles that came out in Collier's magazine talking about what happens when somebody dies. But the real turning point was Jessica Mitford's The American Way of Death. That came out in 1963, and it's really like the seminal book on what happens in the funeral industry and how expensive it is, and the markups are extraordinary. So with this, there became a change in attitude of what was acceptable to do with a body to dispose of it after death. In 1968, the Anatomical Gift Act was enacted. Did I get that right? Yes. Was enacted in order to allow people to donate. Many of us are organ donors, and this is what allows us to do that. In anthropology, we also saw some changes. In 1989, the Vermillion Act was the first one that was put in place by the World Archaeological Congress. It's what Canada uses in particular, similar to what we have now from 1990 with NAGPRA, protecting the remains of the indigenous people who were here prior to the European occupation. As of 2010, 38 states have individual state laws that protect graves. In Florida, we do have one, but you can see that there's still some room for improvement as far as protecting the remains. And you kind of have to think that if somebody was buried, their family buried them with the intent they would stay buried. So how do we get teaching material today? That's the dilemma. And this is Skulls Unlimited. It's one of a couple legitimate resellers of skeletal material. You can see this is what they would call an A1 skull. It has all of its teeth. There's 32 teeth. That's rare because over time they easily fall out of the socket and are lost. So this is a pretty standard price, almost $2,000 for a human skull that's set up for anatomical study. eBay is a source. Believe it or not, it's perfectly legal to purchase human bones. You are supposed to have a medical need of them. If you're a student, you can purchase them. If you're a medical student, if you're a medical doctor, but there's no one out there policing it. In this example, you can see some of the problems with it. This genetics, I keep an eye on this, and I see her or them online all the time. They seem to be pretty legitimate. They look exactly like what they advertise, medical specimens. But this cranium, this is called the calvarium, where it's cut off the top of the skull, does not go with the rest of the skull. You can see this little lip. Now, she's saying it fits well, or they're saying it fits well. But when you're studying a skeleton, you need all the parts to be from the same individual so that you can understand how everything goes together. And that is some of the problems. The bigger problem, and when I pulled this up today because I was waiting to see what was out there, I've often seen things that are absolutely archaeological in nature and should not be on there, and they should not be able to sell. And they've gotten in trouble for it in the past. eBay is trying to take a stronger stand. And I was really happy to see today I didn't see anything that looked archaeological. But 3 weeks ago I did. And I'm sure 3 weeks from now I wouldn't be surprised if I did. So that's one of the problems with the online auction sites. So can't we just make a model? I'm so glad you asked, because I love talking about it. When I was an early student, this is bone clones, and this right here, the one I brought in, and if afterwards anyone wants to look at them, I can show you the difference between real bones and bone clones. This is a European female. She was supposed to be a European female when I bought her, but she's really an Asian female. $259, somewhat affordable for a student, that's starting out. Well, students make sacrifices. I saw that wrinkled forehead. Some of our books cost $200. I'm not sure you guys realize how expensive it is to be a student these days. But if you take a step up, and we're still talking models, we're not talking real skeletons, this is what's called a disarticulated or exploded skull, and there's 27 bones in the human skull. I'm sitting here thinking 26, 27, I don't remember exactly. But you need to be able to see how they all articulate together. You need to know what an individual little nasal bone looks like if you find it in an archaeological context. And you need to be able to tell if it's human or a piece of a deer bone. I was out in the field and stumbled across something that looked like bone, so of course I'm very excited to take a look at it, and it's just deer. But if I haven't seen disarticulated and fragmented human remains, I don't know that. So this is $1,100 if you want to take that step up. But none of them are going to show you the nuances that are necessary for an advanced osteology student. And that's where you really need human bone. So what are we going to do about that? Well, I'm sure you guys have all heard about the Body Farm. Patricia Cornwell kind of made it well-known with her books. Dr. Bass established it to study taphonomy, and the kind of backstory to how he decided that this was needed is he was called in on a forensic case. Somebody had dug into a burial, and they thought that because the remains looked fresh, it was a recent murder buried in this old grave, because the best place to bury a body, everybody, is the cemetery. I mean, that's where they belong. People don't look for them there. So they called him in, and he thought it was reasonably modern. Maybe, I don't remember what his timing was, maybe three months or something, but not really old. He was off by 100 and something years. And it's because the body had been buried in this iron casket, and it was so well preserved. So someone had broken in and vandalized it, but it was not a forensic case. It was a crime, but not a forensic anthropology type case. So he realized that there wasn't enough known about how the human body decomposes and the different factors that affect it, and that's why he started the Body Farm. So the initial purpose is to study taphonomy, which is all the changes that occur to your body after death. But what happens is the body does decompose, and you're left with skeletal remains. And what they've done is really wonderful. They've started the William Bass Donated Body Collection. It was started in 1981. They have about 1,000 bodies right now. They get about 100 donations to the Body Farm per year. So these are going to go into this collection, and it is open to legitimate researchers. You have to apply to go out there and study the bodies, but a lot of students do. And it is the only modern osteological collection in the United States. We have a couple other collections. We have the Hammond Todd collection and the Terry collection. They're both much older, from the turn of the 19th to 20th century and early 20th century. And what happens is there's something called secular change. We were talking a little bit earlier about St. Augustine with Bruce, and he was saying how the Spaniards weren't quite as short as we thought they were, based on changes in the architecture of the homes they lived in. But there is some change that has occurred over time, and when you look at someone who lived in the 1880s, they're not going to have the same patterns of wear on their bones that we're going to have. They had different occupations. So when we're looking at skeletons and studying them, we always have to be conscious of our population sample. Forensically, it's really important to have a modern sample because that's what we're comparing it to. And that's one of the things that has occurred through this William Bass Donated Body Collection. About 60% of the bodies are donated by family members, not the individual who is actually donated, but someone in their family who felt that they would be okay with this, or they had maybe expressed a desire to participate in scientific research but have never gotten around to actually pre-registering. The other 40% is made up of people who did pre-register or medical examiner cases that have been sent to the University of Tennessee for forensic analysis. And once they do this analysis, they then curate the body so it can be studied, and if they determine who the body belongs to, then the family can always request to have it back, or it could stay in the collection depending on what the family wants to do. So, in conclusion, in our past, the commodification of the human body was based on money, class, and race in some cases. In some cases, it wasn't. It was, it didn't matter if you were in a very wealthy cemetery. If you were in the wrong place at the wrong time, you might end up on the dissection table. But it was at the prerogative of a privileged group wielding authority. So again, as you think about these people who did these things, think about why they did it. And go back to being that appendectomy patient and imagine, how were they supposed to learn about the body? Or should we have stayed in the Neolithic with having somebody cut holes in our skull to let the evil spirits out? Presently, drug companies, biomechanical engineers, and medical schools all vie for these limited resources. And us poor osteology students are like at the bottom of the pile. There's even less left over for us. But it's a real problem. And not only that, you have for-profit medical companies as well now with skin grafts and everything else. So what do we do to be able to continue to teach the next generation of doctors and scientists? And it's a real dilemma. There are dated osteological collections. They're still wonderful if that's the period you're studying. But we constantly have to be increasing the modern sample for the needs of people who study modern individuals and to know how people change over time. So in our future, what I would like to see is an enhanced donor program. And I think that's brought about through education and information. And hopefully I've spread a little bit of information. I think it needs to be much broader than what I'm capable of. And I think there are new questions that have to be asked. That's my nothing ventured, nothing gained. So I'll keep this very small because this is truly my soapbox. One of the ways donated bodies are being used is by biomechanical engineers in crash testing. And these people have agreed to this. These are bodies that people have said, I want to donate my body to science. I want you to learn all you can to help other people. So crash me up. I'm already gone. Learn what's happening to my soft tissue. How can you build safety features into cars so that my daughter or my granddaughter is protected? So these people have already agreed to this. But what happens is the velocity is known, the direction of impact is known, everything is known about how this injury occurs, and that's really rare. And then these bodies are cremated. But what about the bones? These bones have fracture patterns that are very specific that no one's looked at. And I think we're wasting a resource. So I think that's the question that needs to be asked of people when they say they want to donate. I think we need to say, there's even more we could learn. Would you be willing? So that's my nothing ventured, nothing gained. And then I think there need to be cross-disciplinary partnerships, and that's what I'm talking about with biomechanical engineers and anthropologists and doctors all working together. So, as an epilogue to Burke and Hare, and again, I am going to have to turn because I don't have it memorized, I loved this. This is what the judge said. So, Burke turned on Hare, turned state's evidence. Burke got off, Hare got condemned. And the judge said, I'm disposed to agree that your sentence shall be put into execution in the usual way, but accompanied by the statutory attendant of the punishment of the crime of murder, viz., that your body should be publicly dissected and anatomized. And I trust that if it is ever customary to preserve skeletons, yours will be preserved in order that posterity may keep in remembrance of your atrocious crimes. And this, I would like to introduce you to Mr. Hare. If anybody's interested, I got a short bibliography I'll tell you about later. And I really need to acknowledge all the people that brought me here tonight. You know, FHSAI, I always love the opportunity to come out and speak. Dr. Williams, who's also been a speaker out here and is amazing, is the one that I took her class, and it made me start to think about how have we gotten these, because I've always been one of those, dig them all up, let me look at the bones, it would be great. But it really made me question how we've gone about it in the past. And Catherine Page is also a bioarchaeologist. She was in my cohort last year. She brought me Fortune's story, and this is part of what I really love about our field, is this is not her area of research. She knew I was working on something like this. And without her, I think the humanity in my presentation would have been lacking. So these are the people that I want to thank for bringing me here. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. 1, 2.
I'm not clear of the function of the body farm. Are bodies buried and then disinterred so they see how they're deteriorating? Is that how it works?
They do. They are buried. They are left on the surface. They are left in trunks of cars. They are clothed. They're unclothed. And all these factors are measured. What difference does it make in the winter if I'm in a snow jacket? How do I decompose, as opposed to the summer in board shorts from going to the beach? So they look at all these different variables. They look at the chemical under the body and the soil. That's another area that they're working on, is chemical analysis, so that could you tell if a body had been there, you know, if it's been moved, if there's a stain in the soil. So they look at all those variables. Okay.
I accessed the site for donating our bodies, and they said you could not donate if you were over 80 years old. This outfit in Tennessee, did they put an age limit?
I don't believe they do, and I would be surprised if they did, because we're really interested in what our bodies. So when we analyze bodies, we either analyze development or deterioration. And we're really interested at the rate that the body changes, in particular in older individuals. So I know on their website they have a link that says, like, if you want to donate, and it'll give you all the information. Another place you could try, though their program is somewhat smaller, is Mercyhurst University. They partner with Mercyhurst University. It's in Erie, Pennsylvania. They also have a donated body program, but that's through LECOM, was a medical school up there. So I'm not sure if they're taking direct donations or if it goes through the medical school.
Does the medical school in Florida take bodies?
I do not know of one here that does. I know there's a body farm in Western Carolina, I believe, but I can get information to Ben. There's several. Since Bass started his, there's one at St. Marcos, Texas. So I could get a list put together and leave it with Ben, so that if you're interested, I can get you some more information.
Patricia, I do believe that UCF now accepts bodies. I saw.
For the med school?
Yes, the med school.
Okay, they may. Now, if they accept bodies, unfortunately, our side of it, we don't partner with them. They're very, their own group. They're very new still, so maybe down the road. And that's what I would really love to see, although please don't tell Dr. Schultz. I would love to see more, partnerships like they have up at Mercyhurst between medical schools and anthropology departments.
some grave robbing going on, isn't there? At the end of the 20th century, the beginning, I remember that they talked about Alistair Cook's body being one that was vandalized.
There's vandalism that goes on today. I mean, unfortunately, I did my undergrad research on the way grave markers changed over time, and I went out to some abandoned cemeteries. One of the men who took me out to one I couldn't have gotten to, I mean, it was back in the woods, and we had a four-wheel drive to get out there. There was what we call an in-ground vault, so that you could see there's a cement vault in the ground with a cement lid over the top that some teenagers had hooked up to the back of their truck, pulled the vault lid off, took the skull into school for show and tell. You would think by teenage years we had gotten a little brighter. And Mike was called in and it was reinterred. But vandalism is unfortunately, I just never goes away.
But also like organized rings through funeral homes and things like
There's most funeral homes, I want to believe, are very good and caring. There have been cases where funeral homes have sold leg bones for donation. I think it's getting much harder to do that. I know that hospitals are required to report it to donation agencies so that they can ask the family, and if the family turns them down, the body through the medical examiner's office would go intact with its bones to the funeral home. And then from there, I mean, I guess you could have corruption anywhere, but I'd like to believe it doesn't happen too much. Anybody else? Thank you.